Politics. It's just started to rain here on Capitol Hill. We have the Supreme Court building behind us. In light of the recent acquittal of Geronimo Yanez, the police officer who fatally shot Philando Castile, and a video that has surfaced that is really heartrending for most Americans to see. I'm talking to Joseph Williams, who is a staff reporter for U.S. News, who recently wrote an article to try to explain some of the underlying legal precedent that seems to always override what many of us feel are videos that are incontrovertible. Can you explain the two cases that you feel come a little closer to me, that came into play in the Castile case?
Sure. There were a couple of Supreme Court precedents. One is Tennessee versus Garner, which is a case in which a police officer shot a man during an arrest. And the other is a case out of Ohio in which a diabetic man had gone into a convenience store to try to get some insulin. The cops thought he was suspicious. They arrested him. They let him go eventually, but he said because of the injuries he suffered as a result of that arrest, he was going to sue the department. He sued the department. He lost. The case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in both cases said that a reasonable standard is the one that had to be met. In other words, if a reasonable police officer was on the scene, would he or she have done the same thing to protect loss of life and to protect themselves from an imminent danger?
So I think all of us are interested in knowing if perhaps another case could be brought involving one of the, maybe not one of the most notorious ones, but involving another case of police brutality or police killings. That maybe when were these cases? They were a while back, right?
These cases came out in the 80s. One, I believe, was 85, and the other, I think, was 88. Currently, there are a bunch of cases that seem to have challenged police law and police ability to use harmful force. But the problem is that there are so many federal laws that stop them right short of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court itself has basically set precedent in this area. In other words, they said, okay, if we think that an officer has reasonably fear of his life, we side on the side of the officer. And that's been a precedent that's been upheld for almost 30 years. And since it's been upheld for almost 30 years, almost no one has challenged it in any significant way because the Supreme Court basically has spoken, and because law enforcement has the general support of not only the federal lawmakers, but lawmakers on a state level. Nobody wants to criticize the police. Nobody wants to have someone criticize them for putting police officers in harm's way. So that's, by and large, one of the reasons why those two Supreme Court precedents haven't been challenged in a reasonable way in almost 30-some-odd years.
So are you saying that at the level, can you go a little bit more over that way? At the level of legal proceedings, not necessarily politics, that race is not an issue when juries are instructed and when juries deliberate on these cases?
Well, as far as I know, race has never been challenged as an issue in a police use of force case. It's always been the same old standard: I feared for my life and the law is on my side. And that, by and large, is why you've not seen any convictions in any meaningful convictions of police use of force in decades. And as a matter of fact, the Walter Scott case was probably about the closest as we've gotten. This is the one where the officer shot the motorist in the back, Walter Scott, because Walter Scott had some priors and was fleeing, in fact, so the officer shot him as he was running away. Again, the defense there was imminent fear. I felt like I was in danger. I felt like he was a danger to myself and the public. Therefore, the jury couldn't reach a substantial verdict and couldn't find this officer guilty, even though there was wide camera evidence that proved him to be at fault here.
Wait a second. He wasn't found guilty?
Well, he wasn't found guilty. I misspoke there. I should say that he was...
Go ahead. Okay.
I should say that he was not found guilty. It was a hung jury. The case ended in a hung jury, which this was a case that was on camera.
Yeah. And he planted a taser.
That's right. It was all kinds of misfeasance, all kinds of evidence and allegations that the officer had done something wrong. Yeah. Race never entered into the case, and the case rose and fall more or less. The prosecution's case rose or fall on use of force in an imminent danger situation.
I thought the first case that you mentioned said that if someone's running away, that you can't say you were afraid for your life.
It did, but that doesn't keep officers from saying, I still feared for my life, and juries looking at the totality of the circumstances and agreeing with them.
Okay, so they know what they have to say, and in at least one case, they know that they have to plant evidence to support saying I feared for my life. And this is where I think race does come in. This is a very fuzzy interpretation, but I feel as if in this country, the ruling class whites have conducted psychological warfare against working class whites to make them unreasonably afraid of African Americans. So when I watched the Philando Castile video, I just don't understand why the man panicked so quickly and fired his gun within 7 seconds. The only explanation that my mind draws to, especially because it happens over and over again, is that he was more afraid of this man because of his race than he would have been if it were me. So is there a way that either in training or in law, or can this Supreme Court help us get to a place where we have some allowance for the fact that just like the children that will choose the black doll over the white doll, they grow up into cops who, for whatever reason, movies they've seen or that sort of thing, are more afraid of African Americans than other people?
Well, there have been study after study, scientific studies, to prove that implicit bias does exist society-wide, and police officers are no different. Implicit bias that they fear a dark-skinned person more than they feel a white-skinned person, and that's been the key there. I mean, those implicit biases have not necessarily come up in jury cases, but they have come up in sociological studies and in lawsuits. The problem is that police departments aren't as progressive as they need to be in identifying implicit bias, training officers to be aware of it because you're never going to get rid of it, and having that training go a step further into dangerous situations on the field. So it is coming to play and to a wider consciousness among law enforcement officials that this is a thing. But you also have to understand that right now we're in an era of Donald Trump, law and order, protect the police. There are several states that have passed what they call a police officers' Bill of Rights. Yeah. And a lot of them kind of build on what society already feels about police, is that they're in a noble profession, they can do no wrong, and that what they are doing is a dangerous job, which it is. I mean, mind you, we have to accept that. But the dangerous job also comes with a certain amount of non-culpability. They haven't been held culpable, not even for shooting African Americans, but for shooting people in cars, for shooting people on the street. So people are aware of it, but there hasn't been any kind of meaningful, substantive change that's allowed this to bubble up through the population, hit the Congress here, the Supreme Court there, and be recognized as a very real danger to a certain segment of the population.
So you mentioned the law and order phrase, which Roger Stone and Donald Trump borrowed from Richard Nixon at a period in our history when we were, I think similar today, going through a lot of soul searching about the proper role of the sons and daughters of Africa in the fabric of our society, 1968. And so I have to tell you, I was in the arena when Donald Trump did his acceptance speech, and I spent a lot of time in environments where you have a 99% white audience essentially rallying around fear and anxiety about African Americans. And when it comes to Black Lives Matter, just the fact that they are asking for reform to make it less likely that the government kills them is tremendously threatening to this community, and they've organized around it. So while I do have sympathy for police officers and for law enforcement leaders who are trying to find the proper balance here, and I think they do have some points, where I really take exception is the political exploitation of these fears that have historical roots that are so just diabolical. And so part of that education, is it possible that part of the education could be that, Alonzo Bodden, who's part of the TYT family, he said recently, make them go to college, pay them a little more, make the police officers go to college so they understand some of the context into which they're entering.
That's a very powerful suggestion, because a lot of people, even African Americans, don't necessarily know the long history of people and conflicts between African Americans and the police departments in this nation. It's long, it's fairly consistent, but a lot of people in the general public don't know, hence a lot of jury decisions that go the other way despite overwhelming evidence. And a lot of people aren't aware that this is actually scientifically proven that bias exists in our society, and that it needs to be addressed not only culturally but also legislatively. But in the current political atmosphere, that's really going to be difficult to do. Training police officers and having a better educated police force is one strong step. It used to be a civil service job that you didn't need anything beyond a high school diploma for, but now it's gradually becoming more and more accepted that police officers have to go at least to community college, have to accept some kind of postgraduate education. Now that is not necessarily a standard. It's more like a cultural shift. You still have a lot of cops out there who didn't complete college, a lot of cops who might have had a substandard education when they were in college, and that carries over into the bias treadmill, if you will, that it keeps happening again and again and again, and it becomes a circular prophecy, and it fulfills itself. And that's something that needs to be addressed and can only be addressed at the command level and at the institutional level across the nation.
One more thing about your article in U.S. News. I appreciated that you, in the second half of the article, you talked about how even though these cases have always, it seems, resulted in acquittals or hung juries, that the activism and the public attention has resulted in some things that have made us more safe and prevented the police killings that we never heard about because they didn't happen.
That's right. One of the things is body cameras. They're not a panacea, but they certainly do provide more evidence than just anecdotal, and it takes it beyond the cop's word against the victims, because in a lot of these cases, the victims aren't even around to tell their side of the story, and that's another factor in a lot of these acquittals. But body cameras, dash cams have been very effective in at least bringing this stuff to light, as well as citizen cameras. There are a couple of ACLU projects out there that teach citizens how to record police interactions that they might pass by on the street. Those are very important. Not only do they tell you how to record it, they also tell you how to upload it to the ACLU, how to get them involved. It comes with a template about filing a complaint about a police officer. So along with institutional reforms, which has been going very, very slowly, you have cultural and populist reforms that are probably going to have much more of an impact because the institutional change is going to take place so slowly.
Right, and so like some of the federal investigations, and you might want to comment on how Jeff Sessions' Justice Department had his first opportunity to file federal charges and declined, but in a case like this. But the federal investigations that came before the Justice Department became what it is currently, that even though they didn't, for instance, Michael Brown find reason to make
they didn't find reasons to indict the officer. Right. However, getting the Justice Department involved opened up a whole new problem for the citizens of Ferguson, ones that the black people on the black side of town kind of understood, but the folks on the white side of town might have turned a blind eye to. Basically, that is the institutional bias, not only in the police department, but also in the court system, in the bail bond system, in the way the town functioned in general. You had citizens going to jail because they were too poor to pay a fine. You had citizens going to jail because they had missed a date on a traffic ticket. You had people who lost livelihoods, homes, families, had to be incarcerated because of a civil crime. That's also been on the national progressive radar when it comes to policing in America and how to get beyond the institutional bias that we're now seeing. Getting the feds involved will not necessarily result in charges. As a matter of fact, the standard is very, very high for the Justice Department to get involved in a police-involved shooting. Even though people often call for a federal investigation, it doesn't result in charges. It results in no charges more often than not. But it does bring a federal eye to some of these law enforcement departments, to some of these practices. You have consent decrees in San Diego, in Oakland. You have consent decrees in San Antonio, almost virtually across the country. The brutal irony, however, was that Tamir Rice was shot and killed in a department that had just come out of federal investigation and was about to reach an agreement for a consent decree for department-wide reforms to keep this sort of thing from happening. So even though it happens, a lot of times it happens far too late for at least one victim and not necessarily in time to save other people who might face a fatal shooting at the other end of a police officer.
I mean, I wanted to point that out because I think a lot of people right now, colleagues, are feeling like, what difference does it make? You know, there's no amount of evidence, no amount of organizing is going to help. But your article does point out that we don't hear about the cases that we prevent by raising this issue. And traditionally, when crimes are committed, we think of a conviction and jail time as the deterrent that prevents it. But there are other factors that are causing these police departments to actually willingly put the cameras on the cops. What do you think it is? What is it? Is it something we're doing? Is it something we could do more that's making police departments change their practices?
What's happening right now, and Black Lives Matter, don't underestimate the impact that it has had on causing police to think about how they do their job, and maybe involve some retrospect. But along with that, there have been $1 million civil judgments. Eric Brown's family got a $1 million civil judgment. That hurts police where it counts most. In the
Eric Garner?
Eric Garner, I beg your pardon. Eric Gardner. That hurts police where that hits police where it hurts most, in the budget, because money is kind of finite, and budgets aren't getting larger except for more militarization. So public awareness, the advent of cell phone cameras has helped tremendously in that it's put this issue on the national radar. Even before then, you'd hear people constantly talk anecdotally about how this happens in the black community and nobody does anything about it. Citizen cameras have probably been one of the single biggest deterrents and one of the single biggest revelations of how this police use of force logic works. So that has been powerful. Lawsuits have been powerful. Federal agencies investigating have been powerful, although I wouldn't necessarily look to that as a solution in this current political climate. So there are things that are happening. Citizen action is happening. Unfortunately, none of this is coalescing fast enough to prevent the next shooting, which I'm pretty sure is probably going to happen before we even know it. Certainly, Supreme Court has not been compelled to take up this issue because the cases are so old and haven't been challenged in some significant amount of time. Perhaps that might happen now that there's more scientific evidence proving that implicit bias exists, also proving that citizen cameras and police cameras record a bit of the truth, at least, that had heretofore had not been empirically had not been seen empirically. I mean, here you have a camera, and the camera supposedly never lies. Now you have images of people actually being shot by the police that have shocked the nation in some cases, and that have really opened the eyes of some folks to the fact that this occurs.
So here's a comment from Facebook. For those of you watching on YouTube, go to facebook.com/TYTpolitics if you want to get into this conversation. Lindsay Norton says, police training in the U.S., kill or be killed. Generate as much revenue as possible. Go after people who probably can't afford a private attorney. How productive or how unproductive do you feel it is to paint with a broad brush the entire profession?
It's not productive in that it impugns the thousands of really good qualified officers who do their job well and who end up not shooting somebody to death. That being said, the constant drumbeat of attention and the constant parade of officers going in and out of the court without being convicted, it does have a lot of people frustrated enough to paint with a broad brush. The police, to this day, you only have a handful of progressive departments who are actually saying, yes, we get it, we understand this is a huge problem. More often you have departments that will go back and circle the wagons and lean on their own code of conduct and say, well, we have it here in our rules, he followed the rules, the shooting was good for us. Take, for example, the case in New York of Eric Garner. The chokehold that was used to suffocate him was illegal by the department's own standards. However, the department standards and actual criminal law are two different things. So while the officers who killed him may have violated their own department standards, they would get nothing more than, say, a reprimand. You might get suspended without pay. You might be relieved of your duty. That's not the same thing as a Supreme Court judgment that will say, okay, you no longer can do these things. And because the standard is so elastic, you don't really have substantive ground-level reforms taking place. Hence, the broad brush. Thank you very much. The broad brush strokes that you have people asserting certain conduct to police. Moreover, if you look at all the European communities, they have far less police-involved shootings than we do. They have far less guns than we do, which is another factor for another discussion for another day. But certainly that plays into it. So it's very easy to look broadly, especially because you don't have people in the department stepping up saying, yes, you're right, we do have a problem. You don't have that on a wide scale. You don't have law reforms, and you don't have Congress or local lawmakers doing something about it.
So here's another one from Jason Cruz. This is the kind of comment that I've encountered a lot in the sort of Trump orbit. Do black lives matter to other blacks? Black on black homicides are a way worse problem than cops killing blacks.
That's a fallacy. That's not true at all. You do have a high number of homicides in the nation, and that's due in part because we've got so many guns and we have lax gun laws. To be able to say that is completely misunderstanding the problem. You were talking about officers who are sworn to uphold the law and protect the citizenry. and they're killing the citizenry. Moreover, you have a system that's institutionally set up to protect the cops from the citizens rather than the citizens from the cops. So that's an easy trope that a lot of people say, but A, it's factually wrong, and B, it misses the entire argument.
I got in an argument with InfoWars propaganda consumer at the RNC convention, and he made that argument. And what I said to him is that when a citizen kills another citizen, that is a crime. When the government kills a citizen, that's oppression. And so unless you're looking through this in a lens that is basically, unless you're one of those people that's been completely dominated by that psychological warfare of the ruling class whites toward the working class whites, just think of this in terms of the government killing its citizens. This ought to upset you.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, few people remember that the police officers represent the government. Yeah. They are hired by the government. They are trained by the government to keep order and protect the citizenry. So no matter what you think about this, you are talking about an institution of the government who has killed a member of the public that they are sworn to protect. Not only is that unseemly, it's also going contradictory against what the sworn oath of the officer is. And you're relying a lot on one person's judgment. And as we said earlier, the victim often isn't there to tell his side of the story.
Yeah. So Ryan Heather asked with a please, Eric, please ask if he agrees that it is a bad batch situation where recruitment processes should be taken apart and completely restructured and refocused. Recruitment and further education.
Yes and no. Yes, in that the officer who shot Michael Brown in Ferguson had been fired from 2 different departments before he ended up in Ferguson. The officers involved in New York City, I think at least one of them might have had a couple of things on his personnel jacket. So yes, there are some bad officers who get carried away. But no, in the fact that you have a lot of officers, we don't know very much about Yormano, the officer, Yormano Yanez in Minnesota. We don't know very much about his background. From all intents and purposes, he is a clean officer who just made a really bad judgment call. So on the one hand, you have good people doing a very difficult job who make mistakes. But on the other hand, you have some predatory officers who might have a different mindset than they ought to. But the bottom line is that when you're the victim and you're on the other end of that gun, it really doesn't matter. And if you're the system who doesn't punish either officer, then that's a problem that we have to solve.
Heather Jenkins wants to know, how can a jury find a police officer not guilty, but then the families and victims are awarded money for being killed? That's confusing.
Well, that's because the civil judgments, the burden of proof is a lot lower than it is in a criminal court. In a criminal court, you have to have beyond a shadow of a doubt. In civil court, it's beyond all reasonable doubt. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. So they are awarded huge penalties because it's easier to convince a jury in civil court than it is in criminal court. But that also being said, the laws protecting cops in criminal court are really very significant and difficult to overcome. To get a conviction of a police officer in criminal court, you almost have to prove intent, that he came upon this motorist getting out of that car knowing he was going to shoot somebody dead. That's murder, that's homicide. That's a lot harder to prove than manslaughter, which essentially is more or less the same conduct, but governed by a different emotional standard. So given that, it's easier and it makes a lot more sense, and you get a lot more judgment and a lot more satisfaction in a civil court than you do in a criminal court. But that doesn't mean that the cases shouldn't be tried in criminal court, because this problem needs to be brought to light, and that in a lot of ways is the only way that a lot of evidence can come out where a broad number of people can see it.
Derek Lawson says, it seems like we treat cops like we treat soldiers during wartime. Regardless of what they're doing, they're fighting a war, quote unquote, so ultimately they can do no wrong. It's a dangerous place to be.
It is a dangerous place to be because to stretch the analogy a little bit further, we also have a militarization of the police departments across the nation. You saw it in 2014 in Ferguson, where officers had sniper rifles, they have armored personnel carriers, they have bazookas in one case. So there is a very strict, blurring of the lines between officers on the beat and the soldiers who go out and defend the nation in time of war. So it's easy for people to get those lines blurred, and it is a very dangerous situation, because if you do hold the cops in such esteem, then you are less likely to hold them responsible for bad behavior. And I think that's part of what we've seen in a lot of these verdicts that have come down in the last several weeks.
Chad Schulten says, people who carry guns should be instructed with better ways to inform police that they are legally carrying a gun. For example, officer, I have to inform you that I have a carry permit and I am carrying a firearm at this moment, which more clearly frames the context of information before giving it to the officer. Instead of I have a gun, which could be mistaken as a threat. Words themselves can make a big difference.
Well, there's a lot of parsing of the issue in that question. Philando Castile did what any reasonable person would have done in that situation. Mind you, he'd been stopped by the cops more than once. So
42?
42. So he kind of knew the drill, yeah. And he also knew and was attempting to do that due diligence. Right. Now, just because you didn't parse the phrasing exactly, that still doesn't mean that you deserve to get shot. Yeah. I mean, you can do it by rote. You can follow all the instructions as we've seen, and people still end up dead. So I think while words do matter, the big picture matters almost as much. He did inform the officer that he had a weapon before reaching for his permit. And that alone should have been enough to cause the officer to at least say, okay, he's letting me know he's trying to follow the law, rather than immediately view him as a threat and open fire inside a car with another woman and a baby in the back.
Yeah. I'm going to resist the urge to talk about the 4-year-old daughter and the footage that came out, because you mentioned another thing that I think we should address. The NRA, Donald Trump, political forces that have rallied around people who carry guns, even when to the point where they aim them at federal officers and they say, yeah, good on you. In this case, they've been silent. Why do you suppose that is?
I have my theories, but in the practice of relatively objective journalism, I have to say that yes, it is striking that they've been completely silent about this. And recall in the Dallas shooting in 2015, I believe, 2015 or 2016.
Which one are you talking about?
The massacre in Dallas with the police officers.
That was 2016.
2016, a year ago.
Yeah.
Well, that in and of itself tells you something, that we mark time by the number of shootings that we have. There was a civil march in Dallas that evening before the gunman opened fire, and one African American was holding an AK-47, and he was swarmed almost immediately by law enforcement. Think back to 2009 when we had a rally not very far from here. I can see the George Washington Monument. The rally was there. People open carried all over the place, and it was almost like, okay, yes, they have a right to do that. So it does make you scratch your head about why one group of people is treated differently than another, especially when the NRA has been so vocal, so vociferous, and spent so much money making sure that their agenda gets out and gets reinforced at every opportunity.
Okay, so as an objective journalist, you can't speculate. But, for those of us who, because the TYT, we sort of straddle that line. And I think that there is a relationship between that psychological warfare that I mentioned, that the ruling class whites use against other whites to make them more afraid, to prevent the coalitions that could challenge them from forming. And, the NRA, Donald Trump, I think those are the people who exploit that centuries-old groundwork that's been laid. And then there are people who ingest that propaganda and unfortunately live by it. And in both cases, we have to find ways to oppose without vilifying, and that's, if you know your history, that's difficult.
Well, it's a very tricky line to approach. I was working on a story the other day, in fact, when I came across some work by the linguist George Lakoff, who he's a really interesting scholar who does scientific studies about brains and how brains receive messages. I would recommend anybody viewing this podcast to watch or read his essays, because they really kind of get to the heart of what you were talking about. And it also helps understand why it's so difficult for these messages from the left to break through to the right.
Yeah. Okay, here's another one. Miss Pamela Fay. I'm sorry about the wind, and it's shaking our camera, guys. If you can't stand shaky camera, go to YouTube. Okay, Miss Pamela Fay says, Black Lives Matter. To say all lives matter is true, obviously, but effectively it shuts down the conversation and recenters it onto white people. Our infrastructure and institutions already acknowledge that white and blue lives matter.
That's true. You can just look at the laws. There are plenty of laws that protect officers if they are involved in a fatal shooting on duty. There are also plenty of organizations, the police benevolent organizations, numerous cop societies that will come to the aid of an officer if he has been involved in one of these type of incidents. What we don't have is the reverse. We don't have a unit that's involved right away that's equivalent to the police unions or the police benevolent organizations if someone is the victim of a crime. Normally, all the channels that progressives have to protest this are taking to the streets, trying to bring attention to this issue. So in that sense, it absolutely is weighted way heavier for the officer than it is for his victim, for somebody who might have shot improperly. And even improper officers, I had a friend say to me, they lose their jobs. They probably will never work in another department again, maybe, if justice is served the way people believe that it should be. However, that doesn't mean that it won't happen again. It also doesn't mean that it will bring back the loved one who might have been killed. And these families are going through, no matter what you think about them class-wise, they're going through a lot of pain and suffering for something that they strongly believe and a lot of other people in society believe should never have happened.
Okay, last one, and then I'll allow you to do any kind of closing statement you want. Stacey Oaks says, citizens should be highly involved in choosing what kinds of training and proper procedure are acceptable in our neighborhoods. There should also be an attainable path for citizens to have more choice in the hiring and firing of such a powerful public position.
That's an interesting proposal, and it probably would carry a lot of weight given the backgrounds of some of the officers who are involved in these shootings. The problem is that it's still a civil service, and it still has to be responsible to the government. And if you have somebody who was not hired, who felt like they should have been hired, here comes a lawsuit. Here comes procedures to change. You can look no further than discrimination lawsuits in police departments, discrimination in hiring, and also discrimination lawsuits for fire departments, two civil service jobs that are highly prized by a lot of people. So it would be great to have citizen input, but don't look for that to get too far, mainly because a lot of the departments are mostly invested in getting people that they think are qualified, that the citizenry might not necessarily agree with them.
Okay, so let us know your Twitter handle. Remind us the name of the article that people need to read to fully grasp the full conversation we've had. And then let us know what, you can talk directly to camera, what do you think are the reforms that, you've studied this for so long, you've reported on it for so long, what do you think are the reforms that would make it more safe for our people of color to go out on the street and not fear that they'll be brutalized or killed by their government?
My Twitter handle is @verbdc. @ verb, D like district, C like Columbia. So that's where you can find me on Twitter. My articles are in U.S. News under Joseph P. Williams. The article that we've been talking about is why police officers don't get convicted. I might be misreading the headline, but if you enter that,
they change it on you, don't they?
They do. But if you change it in the U.S. News search engine, you'll certainly find me in a lot of other articles. I report for the Supreme Court for them. What the reforms that I think need to take place, some of them are happening. Implicit bias training, observing officers, perhaps even two officers, having stringent reviews and psychological evaluations for officers before they join the force, and having consistent and proper review training, not only about use of force, but about interacting with the public. Those reforms are taking place. Some more need to happen, and that includes perhaps a challenge to the Supreme Court to some of the long-held notions about what justifiable force actually is and what the parameters are when officers can use them. So,
one quick thing. I want you to finish that thought, but before we go, I want you to also say, how do we bridge the activism with legal challenges and the other work that you're recommending?
That's a tougher question, mostly because the law enforcement side is very, very strident. You find very few progressives simply because it's the nature of the institution. You'll find some progressive officers here and there who are willing to listen, who are willing to talk, and who are willing to engage in the community. Short of that, the conversation is really, really difficult, mainly because, as we talked about before, it's such a powerful institution that has such broad respect and broad latitude to do what it does in the name of keeping us safe. So I think that keeping an eye on the officers is one reform that ordinary citizens can do, perhaps trying to engage in the officers on a ordinary day-to-day, person-to-person level. Maybe talk to an opponent about the weather before you start talking about whether or not police reforms are necessary. You might get into a heated debate about global warming, but at least it's a start. So one side vilifying the other is a natural habit, and it's a difficult one to overcome. Exactly what the winning formula is, they're still working on it.
Right. I mean, it's easy to organize that way. Your Twitter handle will blow up and all that stuff if you're the best at villainizing, but it's not always the best way to help your community.
Right, and ultimately what we want is for police to guard us, but also be held accountable for their actions.
Yes.
That's the simplest, most basic premise that the activists for against police brutality are coming from. Just treat people equally, try to be aware, and try to do your job as best you can without letting these kind of other biases get in the way. So that's where the conversation is starting. Where it goes from there, anyone knows.
Joe Williams, U.S. News, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
We'll talk to you again.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.